So, good evening. Welcome to the webinar on gut feelings, the microbiome as a key regulator of brain and behavior. First of all, I would like to introduce Professor John Cryan. Professor John Cryan is chair in the Department of Anatomy and Neuroscience at the University College Cork in Ireland. And he is a principal investigator in the Alimentary Pharmabiotic Center, the Microbiome Institute, world famous institute on microbiome science. Yeah, Professor Cryan has many publications, as you probably know, on the area of the connection of the gut microbiome with brain and behavior. And therefore, we are really very, very pleased to have him here with us today to give this very interesting talk. So, Professor Cryan, thank you for accepting our invitation with us. I'm going to explain very quickly to the audience the way of making questions or posting questions, and then I will give you the floor. So, entonces, en español, bienvenidos y buenas tardes. Fíjense en el panel superior, creo que ustedes tienen un área donde pone preguntas. Puede que ponga questions o que ponga preguntas. Si lo despliegan, ahí pueden escribir preguntas en cualquier momento a lo largo de la charla. La charla será de unos 40 minutos, alrededor de unos 40 minutos. Las preguntas las pueden poner en castellano, en español o en inglés, como ustedes prefieran. Y cuando acabe la charla, la conferencia del doctor Cryan, pasaremos a hablar de las preguntas que ustedes hayan hecho. So, thank you, Professor John Cryan. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francisco. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you all this evening. I hope you're all keeping well and safe, and that over the next 45 minutes or so, that I can share with you the journey that we've been on here in Cork, in the very south of Ireland, for well over a decade now, implicating what's going on in the gut with what's going on in the brain. Now, like many of you, I work in a medical school, and in medicine, everything more or less comes back to Hippocrates. Now, Hippocrates is thought to have said, now it also could be fake news, but he's thought to have said that all diseases begin in the gut. And that can be quite surprising, and especially when I talk to my neurology or my psychiatry friends, they might find that is very strange thing to think about in 2,000 years later. But perhaps there is something to this. And all we have to do is look to our language. And, you know, we use phrases like gut feelings, gut instincts. When we're disappointed, we're gutted. We make gut-wrenching moves. When we're nervous, we have butterflies in our tummy. So we personify our emotions in our gut. And so perhaps there is an underlying neurobiology about how this gut is actually controlling what's going on in our brain in different ways. And this is Eli Mechnikov, and some of you may know who this is, and he's kind of one of the heroes in this whole story, and every story needs a hero. He's an unlikely hero, though. He's a Russian working at the turn of the last century in Paris at the Pasteur Institute, where he made seminal discoveries about how our immune system works. He discovered the process of phagocytosis, and he won the Nobel Prize for this classical work. But what I want to introduce him to you is in a different context, as later on in his career, as often happens great scientists, he started coming up with really crazy ideas, and he was full of these ideas. And one of the things that he was really focused a lot of his later attention on was, why did people in parts of what's now rural Bulgaria, why did they live longer and healthier? And he wrote about it extensively. And what he put it down to was it was what they ate. And what they ate was a lot of fermented food containing lactic acid bacteria. So he's not only the father of modern immunology, he's also the father of probiotic science and the father of really of geriatric science in terms of comprehensively exploring the natural history of disease in aging. And so if you go to Korea, you can get a yogurt drink which has Metchnikoff's picture on it. So it must have that Nobel sign of approval, and it must be good for you overall. But for the most part, Metchnikoff's ideas were forgotten about. And we'll come back to Metchnikoff a little later. I put him here because I wanted to reinforce what really is the focus of my lab, which is really trying to understand the relationship that the microbiome has with the brain at key windows, time windows across the lifespan. In particular, we're really interested in what's going on in the perinatal period, in prenatally, in infancy, and all the way through to adolescence. We're also very interested in aging, based on Metchnikoff's work, and how the aging brain is receiving potential signals from the microbiome that we have overall. And so therefore, we're beginning to really see a very close, intricate relationship between the microbiome and the brain at these key windows across the lifespan. So where do we get our microbes for? Well, for the most part, we're thought to be sterile in utero. And as we are being born, as we emerge through the birth canal, we get these early colonizers, early microbes. And they are, the composition of these microbes then can be influenced by a variety of factors early in life and all the way through as we age. And these factors include diet, our host genetics, the environment we live in, the exposure to drugs or particularly antibiotics early in life, and other lifestyle factors. And one of the key things that we've been really interested in understanding in terms of shaping the early life microbiome has been the mode of delivery at birth. Because, as I mentioned, we get our microbes as a kind of a birthday present from our mothers as we emerge through the birth canal. The question then happens, well, what happens if we're born by C-section? Do we bypass these microbes? And this goes back to early work from Gloria Domingos-Bello's group over a decade ago now, where she showed quite clearly that the microbiome is different in infants that were born by C-section here in blue versus those born vaginally. That is a relatively small sample size and pilot study. It has been followed up by, most notably, this paper in last October in Nature, which clearly again shows a very, very distinct different microbiome in infants born vaginally than those born by C-section. And then in this really large study, in the TEDI study, where over 12,000 individuals are being assessed. And again, birth mode is being seen as a clear key factor shaping the microbiome in early life, as has been the mode of nutritional provision also. And so therefore the microbiome, and that's put forward in this in the cover of Nature, is really a security blanket shaping the immune system and shaping the programming of all the systems in the body in early life. Now, we know from a variety of epidemiology and experimental studies that being born by C-section increases the relative risk of asthma, of allergy, of type 1 diabetes. What we don't know is really so much about it in the context of brain health. And this is something that we've been working on using animal models and also some experimental studies cross-sectionally in the population. And what we find is that there is an enduring effect of C-section that really primes the stress system and the social brain in different ways. And that data we're just getting ready now for publication. But the question remains, though, that because C-section is an important surgical life-saving intervention in many cases, is there a way to try and reverse some of the potential deleterious effects of changing the microbiome early in life by C-section by other means? We've heard some studies about the anointing of the mom's vaginal microbes directly onto the infant. However, they are largely not seen to be overly safe and have not been recognized by the major obstetrics and gynecology societies. But there are other strategies that we can think about, and they largely are focused on dietary interventions and also in supporting the enrichment and bolstering of breastfeeding by other means to try and really recapitulate the microbiome that we might see in early life. It's early days in these types of studies, but it is something that's we're going to hear more and more of as time goes on. And this is especially important because we know in certain parts of the world that there's been a huge increase in the levels of C-section. For example, in parts of Brazil, C-section rates are over 70%. In parts of China, over 60. But also in developed worlds where for convenience and other ways, people want to be able to plan more what's going on. So these types of approaches of targeting the microbiome in early life to hopefully foster the appropriate microbes that might support a more adequate brain development is really important. Now, so these are some of the data we have, but my neuroscience colleagues, well, they're a very skeptical bunch, so they need more evidence. So how do you get evidence that the microbiome is actually important in brain health? Well, like in all aspects of engineering or biology, perhaps the best way to figure out if something is important is to take it out and see what happens. And so the concept of growing up germ-free is nothing new at all, but we've been able to use what we call germ-free mice to enable us to see what happens to the developing brain in a mammalian system when we don't have microbes in there. And over a variety of years, our group and other groups in Sweden and in Canada and in the US have shown a variety of changes induced by the absence of microbes in the brain. Perhaps the most critical of these, or most surprising of these, was a finding we had a number of years ago now, was when we showed that myelination patterns in the prefrontal cortex of germ-free mice were quite different. Now, myelin, as some of you know, is basically the insulation on which allows nerve cells to conduct appropriately. We mainly hear about myelination in the context of demyelinating disorders like multiple sclerosis. Well, what we found was that in our germ-free state, in the prefrontal cortex, and predominantly in the male brain, that there is a hypermyelination. Now, increased myelination, we don't see that often in nature. It occurs in certain rare autisms. But this was a really remarkable finding, in my view, because it was able for us, for the first time, to link what's going on in the gut in terms of gut microbes and the appropriate education of our myelination patterns in core circuits that are really crucial for neurodevelopment. We've shown some years ago in the cover here of this journal Biological Psychiatry that adult hippocampal neurogenesis. Neurogenesis is the birth of new neurons, and we know these new neurons that are born throughout our life are really important in complex cognitive events. They help us to be able to separate different patterns. They have a role in antidepressant action and are also affected by things like inflammation and stress and aging. And we found out that basically the regulatory break and how these new neurons are formed is out of kilter in these germ-free animals. We found changes in dendritic growth and in dendritic spines across a variety of brain areas and a variety of changes in neurotransmitters, including changes of long-term potentiation, which is the molecular basis for learning and memory. The animals have deficits there when they don't have microbes. Now, microglia are the immune cells, macrophages of the brain. And they're really important in shaping circuits in the brain, and particularly in relation to synaptic pruning. And so quite some years ago, a number of groups, including Marco Prentz's group in Freiburg and Sonia Garel's group in Paris, showed very clearly that the microglia remain immature in germ-free animals, and that for appropriate activation of these microglia required to have microbes in the lumen of the gut. Finally, the blood-brain barrier is really crucial in protecting the brain from exposure to a variety of chemicals and agents that you don't want to get into the brain. And so it's really important also in drug delivery. And work from Sven Pettersson's group at the Karolinska in Singapore a number of years ago showed very nicely that there was a relationship between the microbiome and the permeability at the blood-brain barrier. Now, here is an example from our work of a neuron from the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is the brain area, an almond-shaped brain area involved in fear learning. It's involved in the emotional aspects of pain. It's also involved in social interactions. And you don't need to be a neuroscientist to be able to see quite clearly that in our germ-free animals, we have a very different arborization of this neuron than compared to control animals. And this is quite startling and quite dramatic, I find. And understanding the molecular basis of this is something that we've spent a lot of time now over the last number of years using a variety of omics-based technology to try and understand this. Overall, and it's still relatively early days, but it's very exciting to be able to see how much the brain requires microbes in our gut for appropriate development. What does this translate to at the level of behavior? Well, what we've shown before in this paper was that fear learning, so the ability to associate certain fearful stimuli with certain sounds. So here sounds are paired with the foot shock. And the animals can learn this pretty okay, but when we're asking them here in red to remember it, they have deficits in this memory. And we can replace, by putting back in microbes post-weaning, we can recover this. So this is a fundamental aspect about our survival, about how we remember things that are threatening to us, and microbes are playing a key role in this. I mentioned the amygdala playing a role in visceral pain and in pain sensitivity. Now, abdominal pain is a core symptom of irritable bowel syndrome. And IBS is a very, often unloved disorder, and we really need to understand more the neurobiology of it. But it's really been seen more and more as a disorder of not just the gut-brain axis, but also the microbiome gut-brain axis. And here we can see, in the absence of microbes in these germ-free GF animals, there is an increased visceral pain, and that is quite dramatic. Now, one of the things we wanted to look at, and this was driven by our interest in findings that most of the effects we see are more prominent in males than females, and also with this hypermyelination, which we see only also occurring in rare autisms. We started looking at some of the core symptoms of autism. And mice, like humans, are quite social. So we wanted to see, well, how do these animals react to social stimulus? So if you put a mouse in a chamber and give it access to another mouse or an empty chamber, a normal mouse will gravitate towards the other mouse and really enjoy the social interaction and spend time in the social interaction. But not if you're germ-free. They don't distinguish. Now, mice, well, perhaps like some humans, can be a bit fickle. So if you give them the opportunity to spend time with a new mouse versus their everyday playmate, they'll prefer the new playmate. but again, not into their germ-free. They're not able to distinguish between known and unknown social interactions. They also have increased repetitive behaviors. So what we're beginning to see is that some of the core symptoms relevant to autism require microbes in your gut to manifest these appropriately. So if we don't have microbes in our gut, we have social deficits and communication deficits and increases in repetitive behavior. So more recently, we've been looking at this in greater detail across the animal kingdom in a way to see if we could also potentially start to extrapolate this to humans. But if you go all the way back down the evolutionary tree, looking at, for example, insects, honeybees, start moving to vertebrates like zebrafish, in hyenas, in birds like zebra finches, even koala bears, all the way through non-human primates, we find out two things that are seemingly emerge quite often. One is that if we start interfering with the microbiome, we can interfere with social brain and the circuits that are underpinning that. Once we start to, and so therefore they're intrinsically linked, our ability to engage in social interactions and the composition of the microbiome. And then vice versa, if you start changing social interactions, social hierarchies, social stress, and various other things, you can start to see there's a change occurring or starting to occur in the composition of the microbiome. So God only knows what has happened to all our microbiomes after these last number of months of social isolation and social lockdown. But I wouldn't be surprised if there is some really marked effects. And so one of the core things that we're really interested in our lab to do into the future is to see to what are the constraints on the microbiome in the gut in shaping normal social behavior. How can that be exploited into a larger way of understanding of different aspects of trust, competition, allowing teamwork? And then as we move into a more disease orientation, can we harness this to look at disorders of sociability like autism, but not only autism, like the social deficits are very clearly seen in schizophrenia, and also things like social anxiety disorder, and even in the social deficits that you might see become associated in chronic gastrointestinal disorders, where people don't want to mix in public because of some of the embarrassment associated with that. So we're only at the beginning, but it's a really exciting area and something that I'm really never thought about that we would find. And it really comes back to framing things within an evolutionary context. So this is something that also Seth Bordenstein, who is a co-author on this paper we had in Science, and I have been talking about for some time, because one of the things we have to remember about the microbiome and the brain is that the microbes were there first. There never has been a time when the microbiome existed independent, that the brain existed independent of signals from the microbiome. So we really need to reflect on this more and more as we move forward and really understand that our microbes are really our friends with benefits. And in this case, they're our friends with social benefits. Okay, so that, is more or less some of our work that we've been moving forward on in relation to the microbiome in early life. But the other area that I'm really excited about right now is understanding the microbiome and its role on the adolescent brain. Now, my title within the medical school is Professor of Anatomy, so I always like to show this anatomy cartoon up here in the top right. This is the anatomy of the teenage brain, and those of you with teenagers will appreciate that there is many differences in this teenage brain than in the adult brain or in an infant brain. And this amazing teen brain, though, really is a brain that is still very much under construction. And one of the most exciting areas in biological psychiatry right now is trying to understand what are the vulnerability factors and what are they doing in driving change at the neurobiological level in the brain. And so factors like the pruning induced by microglia on neural circuits, and trying to understand how that may be important and shaped by things like in lifestyle like diet, and how that may give rise to a variety of key disorders that start to emerge during these teenage years, whether it's substance use disorders, eating disorders, ADHD, schizophrenia, especially adolescent onset schizophrenia. And so a lot of focus on the adolescent brain literature right now and research has been trying to understand what do these insults like alcohol, stress, poor nutrition, inadequate sleep, drugs of abuse, all of that screen time. What is, a lot of people focusing on the potential damage that that might have on the adolescent brain. But people are neglecting what are these factors doing on the adolescent gut and the gut microbiome, and how that might be signaling to the brain and how that may be out of kilter. So this is something that we've been working on a lot, going back to this animal study from a number of years ago, where we showed in male animals that if we depleted the microbiome from adolescence up to adulthood, that we got clear differences in behaviors relevant to anxiety, relevant to working memory, and relevant to social cognition. Again, social behaviors being quite sensitive to these changes. More recently, this is a study championed by Christine Fwilling in my lab, where we've been looking at the impact of bad diets, either high-fat diets or the dreaded cafeteria diets in animal models, and showing that there are long-term enduring effects of these diets when they're just given during this adolescent period, just given during these equivalent of high school years. And basically, they cause a long-term enduring neuroinflammation in the amygdala. When we look at amygdala genes that are involved, many of them are involved in neuroinflammatory processes. And also, we get enduring effects at the level of the microbiome and enduring effects at the level of genes relevant to myelin in the prefrontal cortex. Moreover, in a collaboration with Beatrice Pisani's group in Florence, and this is a complicated slide, but we don't need to go into the great details. It's just that here we have an animal model where animals were stressed during adolescence and examined on behavior. In this case, learning and memory behavior in adolescence or in adulthood. And what we found was that there was clear deficits in behavior. And if we supplemented with a very enriched diet, and this diet was enriched with polyunsaturated fatty acids, these omega-3s, and vitamin A, we were able to reverse many of these behavioral deficits. So that's really nice to see that there is a supplemental diet that can offer, some form of buffering against the effects of stress in adolescence. Moreover, when we started examining the microbiome, we could clearly see, especially in adolescence, that there were marked changes at the level of the microbiome, and future studies are needed now to really tease apart the causal relationship between these microbiome changes and the cognitive changes that occur in adolescence. Okay, I want to fast forward then to aging. We know that inflammaging is very much a feature of everyday aging, activation of our immune system, and very well studied. But we also know that aging has deleterious effects on the cardiovascular system and on the gastrointestinal tract, and of course on the brain and behavior. So this goes back again to what Metchnikoff was talking about. I mean, this is exactly what he would have predicted. And now, many years ago, my colleagues in Cork published this paper in Nature, where they showed that in the elderly population, that if their health outcomes were directly related to their composition of their microbiome. Those that had a very diverse microbiome had a much better health outcome in terms of markers of frailty, for example. And they went one step further to see what was driving this diversity in the microbiome. And what they put it down to was diversity in the diet. So very clearly, we have a diet, microbiome, gut-brain axis in aging. And so now one of the questions we have is, how do we do, besides diet, is there other approaches we can target the microbiome to look at this, especially in the context of immune system, inflammation, and brain aging? We've been revisiting these concepts of Mexikoff in our animal models, and we've shown, for example, that there is chronic inflammation, changes in the microbiome, and an exaggerated intestinal permeability, this leaky gut phenomenon occurring both at baseline and following an acute stress in aged mice. But can we rescue this? Well, this is a study that we published recently, where we decided to target the microbiome with what we call a prebiotic. And in this case, it's a prebiotic called inulin. Now, inulin is found very heavily in leeks, in artichokes, and in many green vegetables, and very common. Here we supplemented mice, and we focused here on middle-aged mice, maybe because it's a time window I'm particularly interested in myself, for obvious reasons. But and in middle-aged mice, we see that there's already an increased neuroinflammation occurring, including stress-induced immune priming, infiltration of inflammatory monocytes, and increased microglia activation. And we were able to, by giving this inulin supplementation, we were able to dampen down this pro-inflammatory phenotype. And this is work of Marcus Boehm, a postdoc then in the lab, in collaboration with my colleagues, Ted Dinan and Harriet Shellikins. And really, perhaps, the take-home message for this study is that if you're thinking of having a midlife crisis, maybe instead of going for the motorbike, you should pick the leeks instead, and that the inulin you get there may help your brain have a better dealing with such a crisis. But the field is still grappling with one big conundrum, and that is how. How is all this happening? How are microbes in the lumen of the gut sending signals to the brain and changing complex behavior? And we're still really only in the beginning of really understanding this and trying to work this out. We know that there are many pathways involved, and multiple of them are probably at play at any one time. One pathway that we're particularly interested in is the vagus nerve. Now, vagus comes from the Latin for vagrant or wandering, and this vagus nerve is able to receive signals from the variety of organs and send them to the brain and to then influence brain circuits. And also it tells us sends signals from our brain back down to the organs, and in particularly our gut and our small intestine. We were interested some years ago whether the vagus was playing a role in the behavioral effects of a single bacteria, in this case, Lactobacillus. And together with John Bienenstock's group in Canada, we performed vagotomy. We basically cut off this highway of communication. And to make a long story short, all of the effects of this Lactobacillus were gone when we performed vagotomy. And this tells us that what happens in vagus doesn't just stay in vagus, but will actually affect our emotions. Now, this is just one pathway, and there are probably other things involved, and how the vagus, once its signals get to the brainstem areas here, the nucleus tractus solitarius, how do they signal to the rest of the brain? These are all ongoing programs of research we have within the lab, championed by Christine Fulling, a postdoc in the lab at the moment. Another factor that's really important to mention is the fact that the microbiome is really like a little factory, producing all kinds of weird and wonderful chemicals that our bodies wouldn't have otherwise. Among these are short chain fatty acids. So this is really, really important. And so it was really striking to me to see, well, maybe we could just bypass the microbes altogether. And what would happen if we just fed animals short chain fatty acids? And when we did this, we were able to attenuate the long-term effects of psychosocial stress on behavior, on physiology, on gut permeability. And so it's telling us that it's what the bugs are making that's really important, that just being there is not enough, that they have to act and act up. And so, you know, this is an important thing we know also in all aspects of life. It's not just being there, it is actually what we're doing that it has the consequences. So all of these studies that I've showed you really, you know, emerge from this a lot of basic neuroscience and basic work from animals. But really, the goal now is really to move into human translation. And so, together with my colleague Ted Dinan, we've come up with this concept called psychobiotic, which is basically any type of intervention that we can target the microbiome for mental health benefits. You know, we have a variety of different strategies to do that. Some of them I've already mentioned, like prebiotics, the dietary substances that act as the kind of substrates on which the factories work on to produce the key chemicals. Fermented foods. We just recently published a paper about the fermented food kefir and its importance in shaping gut-brain signaling. I mentioned a variety of probiotic strains, predominantly of the bifidobacteria and lactobacillus families, and also synbiotics when we combine pro and prebiotics together. Postbiotics are approaches like the short chain fatty acids, just using what the actual chemicals that the bugs are making and focusing on that. And then there's an intriguing idea of paraprobiotics, which is basically, do the bacteria have to be alive? And we know there is some evidence that certain strains of bacteria can, by what's decorating their cell walls or by how they're interacting with the immune system or epithelial cells in the gut, we're beginning to really see that they can have marked effects on brain and behavior as well. But I put this in here because this is Tracy Chapman, and it's over 30 years ago since she was singing about fast cars and talking about a revolution. And, you know, in that time, we haven't had much revolutionary ideas in the concept of treating and managing and preventing mental illness. And so perhaps it is time for what we've coined the psychobiotic revolution. Maybe it's a time that we need to think about nurturing our gut, nurturing our microbes, and maybe this might be a strategy that might be beneficial to how our brain works. But we need evidence. And do we have any? Well, it's beginning to accumulate. Initially from animal studies, where we began to show that a variety of different approaches, like I mentioned, whether it's kefir, short-chain fatty acids, certain prebiotics or certain probiotics, when given to animal models, can have marked behavioral effects on anxiety, on depression-like behavior. They can enhance cognition and reduce the stress response. They can change the levels of GABA and serotonin in the brain. But this is mice, and we don't need to cure these disorders in mice. We need to cure them in humans. So here is a study we did some years ago where we took normal, well, Irish medical students, if you consider them normal, healthy volunteers, and we basically we gave them a bacteria. This is a Biflongum 1714, which came through our preclinical pipeline. It had really nice efficacy in our animal models. And here's Andrew Allen, the psychologist on our team. And so we looked at what would happen if a small group of people, 22 individuals, took this Biflongum for a number of weeks, and then we tested them in the lab. And we have very nice ethical ways of stressing individuals in the lab. And we looked at how they dealt with this stressful situation. And basically, we looked at also their brains in terms of EEG signature and some of their cognitive effects. And to make a long story short, what we found was that there is a clear relationship between those that had taken the probiotic and their stress response, etc. So it really was very exciting to see something that we had taken from our animal experiments all the way to humans. This has been nicely built on from a nice study from Paul Ing's group in Tübingen in the past year, where they showed that individuals that were put in a brain scanner, that they basically had a stressful situation where they're playing a ball game with two others, and then all of a sudden the other two people start to exclude them in this cyberball task. And those that had taken the biflongum, they didn't mount the same brain response to the stressor. So this is really exciting and really good and encouraging. We also took our most positive probiotic strain and tested it in similar types of tests. And you cannot get more negative data into the one paper than we did in this study here. So this highlights the difficulties we have in translating some of these animal studies into human studies. And but this is not unique to the microbiome field or any other field. It's common in many other fields as well. So we need to do a lot more human studies in key populations to really understand the extent to which psychobiotic revolution is ready for prime time or not. This is a nice study from the group of Jeroen Reis's group in Belgium, where they looked at a large-scale population, over 1,000 individuals of Flemish people, and showed that those that had depression had a very different microbiome. They were able to identify what were the potential of this microbiome to make key chemicals, neuroactive chemicals. They then went and looked at another large population of people from the Netherlands, and were able to show that their quality of life, which is often associated with poor depression outcomes, was also associated with these same neuroactive agents. So we're really beginning to see in disorders like depression that to counteract it, we see it as a disorder of inflammation, stress, and the microbiome, and that to counteract it, we really need to get the fourth part of this clover overall. I won't go into this into detail. I just wanted to mention that we're also trying to identify what the chemicals that these bacteria are making. Can we make basically new drugs to emerge? Can we use it as a drug discovery platform? And can we then, when we do that, can we screen in vitro and then all the way up to human studies? There's a lot of focus on this in the literature, and particularly, as many of you know, that G protein coupled receptors, that most of the drugs, for example, in pharmacies today are targeting G protein coupled receptors. And now we're beginning to see that many of the ligands for these orphan receptors are also being synthesized by bacteria. And so the question remains is, can we harness this to beneficially activate or antagonize these G protein coupled receptors? This is an example from our own research. I won't have time to go into it, but it's just showing, for example, that certain microbial metabolites like short-chain fatty acids can attenuate the signaling of ghrelin receptors. And ghrelin receptors are very involved in obesity and food intake, and that's really important. We're also beginning to really appreciate the importance of the microbiome in interacting with drugs, be they drugs, environmental drugs, be they drugs that we take every day. And so there's been a real excitement trying to understand the role of the microbiome from drugs ranging from digoxin to the statins, right through to psychotropic medications. And of course, that's where my interests are, being a neuroscientist and a neuropharmacologist. And it's worth reminding people that the first antidepressants emerged as from antibacterial agents. And so isoniazid was discovered as an anti-tuberculosis drug, and it later became an antidepressant. And so what we're beginning to see is that a variety of psychotropic medications that are used in mental health management today are having the potential to be acted on by the microbiome or to change the microbiome themselves. And that maybe that, as J.K. Rowling called the chamber of secrets, that maybe the microbiome is really this chamber with many hidden secrets that we're only in the beginning to understand how this will work and moving forward. We've shown this in studies with antipsychotics in particular, and this has been also shown in large-scale screening studies that antipsychotics are inducing maybe some of their negative side effects by activating the microbiome. Finally, I want to mention where we're going, and this is work from Kirsten Berding-Harold in the group, is we're really trying to triangulate. Can we develop a microbiome targeted diet that will support brain health? And therefore, can we, if we really increase the levels of fibers, fermented foods, and have a Mediterranean style diet on top of that, which is really good for our microbiome, will it improve brain health? And these studies are ongoing right now and are quite promising. But what we're beginning to see is that our state of gut will markedly affect our state of mind. And this is not just in psychiatry. This is also relevant to neurology. And we had this article that made the cover of Lancet Neurology a few months ago, where we're beginning to really see that across a multitude of brain disorders, there is a link now between the microbiome and signaling to the brain. It's early days. We don't know what it means, but don't forget that we treat some aspects of epilepsy through diets, through the ketogenic diet. And so it shouldn't be that surprising. These are exciting times, but we also need to be cautious and build data, and we need not to hype things up too much, but it is really, really exciting. This is our team here in Cork, a wonderful group of fabulous people, including many, many scientists from Spain and Portugal. Again, I want to leave you with Hippocrates. Hippocrates is also thought to have said, let food be thy medicine. But I'm going to change that to let food for your microbes be your medicine. And so thank you very much for listening. And I'm very happy to take some questions. And you can follow me on Twitter if you're interested in this type of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this very comprehensive review of the state of the art in this so noble area. I think it's a universe of science coming, of possibilities all the way through. There are several questions, many questions. From the very beginning, when you were talking about the cesarean section versus vaginal birth, Anna made the question, is any way to change your microbiome during life, or you got your microbiome and there's no way of changing your gut microbiome?
Yeah. So yeah, no, it's a great question. What we think is that it is during early life, it is particularly more tractable to change the microbiome during the first 2 to 3 years, because it's developing and it's been shaped, and there are various key events within that, whether through weaning and then developing. And then we know from studies where people change their lifestyle, they move country or they change their diet, it definitely can change their microbiome. So there are many ways of looking at this. What we think is that some of the effects of early life happen quite early on, and that the microbiome itself will resolve with time, but maybe some of the signaling pathways in the brain have already modified or are changed already. But what we know is, and this is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the microbiome field in general, is that just taking a single bacteria, whatever strain that is, that has been shown to have positive effects in adulthood, can modify metabolism, can modify behavior. So that's really remarkable, that even in adulthood, when our microbiomes are mostly already shaped, that we can have these effects.
There's a question from Pedro. I believe that he's from Portugal, asking about if you think that intermittent fasting plays a role in the gut microbiota, or how this might affect, how much they affect behavior, the intermittent fasting.
It's a great question. I mean, it's a very hot topic right now. We've been really interested more recently in, I didn't have time to go into it, but in terms of our microbiome has a circadian rhythm. and understanding that circadian rhythm is going to be really important for metabolism, but also for brain function. And intermittent fasting will change that rhythm of our microbiome because you're not providing the substrates, and so it's at different times. So it's a way of shifting it. And so perhaps some of the beneficial effects of intermittent fasting are probably mediated through the microbiome. But we need more data, but there are some really encouraging studies.
Yeah, there are several questions from diet. One is because someone asked, Ramon is asking that has been proved that Japanese and Mediterranean people live longer. This has been related to diet, to dietary habits. You think is this effects of habits of diet are mediated by the microbiome?
Yeah, it's another good question, and people have started to study this. My colleague Paul O'Toole and many others in Italy have been looking at this. There have been studies on the microbiome of the super centenarians in Italy, in particular, and as well as in the Okinawa areas in Japan, and the microbiome seems to be different. But it's not clear. Cause and effect is difficult to disentangle here because the diet is so intrinsically linked to the microbiome. But it is intriguing to think that. We think that aging can be somewhat slowed down by targeting the microbiome in some ways, but we don't have all of the evidence that we need to fully, support that yet. But it's really exciting area.
And also the relationship with diet, and also in your experiments with mice, adolescent mice. So you found effects in two ways. One was depletion of the microbiome. So I suppose this was antibiotic use, so had a wrong effect. And the other was by addition of vitamin E and polyunsaturated fatty acid. So do you think this was the antioxidant effect? How do you explain those data?
So my collaborators would have thought it's probably due to antioxidant or due to membrane potential effects of PUFAs and on incorporation into membranes, until we showed them the microbiome data. Once we showed them the microbiome data, it's really intriguing to think that it could be the microbiome that could be really playing the effects. And indeed, we know that omega-3s can have certain prebiotic effects on the microbiome themselves. The vitamin A, we're not so sure yet, but it is intriguing.
There's another question in the relationship between Parkinson's disease and the gut microbiota. You mentioned at the end Alzheimer's disease, among others. And it's a question telling by Eduardo. You think that the oral microbiota might be related with the origin of such diseases, Parkinson, Alzheimer?
Interesting question. We know very little about the oral microbiome and the gut-brain axis in general. My gut feeling right now is that it's probably not playing as big a role as in other diseases. We know it probably is playing a role in areas of cardiovascular control by the microbiome or in cancers. In terms of affecting nitrogen signaling within the oral cavity, I don't know. It's difficult to think. What we do know is that the gut microbiome is playing a really interesting role in shaping the transmission of synuclein to the brain, and we know that there are direct relationships because amyloid in the gut is acting perhaps as an antimicrobial peptide, and there's a relationship there between amyloid and what's going on. So it's too early days to say about the oral cavity. We need more data, but I would suspect that the gut is playing a really important role.
There's another question coming from Portugal about your thoughts about these carcinoid syndromes and serotoninergic production. If there's any study relating these syndromes in excess serotonin production related with the microbiota, with the gut microbiota.
Which syndromes, Francisco?
Is the carcinoid syndromes.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And the other one, this with its excess serotonin, serotoninergic. Yeah.
Serotonin. Yeah, I mean, everything is plausible. There's no data that I'm aware of. We do know that the microbiome has the ability to modify the production of serotonin in the gut, to the production of serotonin that gets into the plasma, and the production of serotonin in the brain. So we know that in animal studies. We don't know how much of that translates to the human setting overall.
Is another question related also with the psychobiotics. You know, if this the Bifidobacterium longum 1714 is already on the market, or is still being investigated?
Yeah. No, that bacteria was launched on at least the Irish and the UK market, so it's available on them markets. I don't know in Spain or Portugal.
Okay, all right.
It may be.
And so it may be. So yeah, there are still many questions, but I think that we are running out of time. There's a comment by Janet about the constipation in patients with Parkinson's disease. Maybe you think that the use of probiotics to improve intestinal transit might have a good effect also in the development of the disease?
We don't know. I mean, it's clear that constipation is often occurs first and is often a pre-signal of Parkinson's. We also know the interaction between the bacteria and the medication L-Dopa. There's a lot of information coming out on that as well. But I would be cautious that once the disease has migrated to the brain, whether the probiotics will have any benefit at all. I would be cautious on that aspect, but definitely for the gut effects.
Maybe now the last question is related to your book, The Psychobiotic Revolution. Is there any translation to Spanish of the book, or still?
It's coming. The Spanish translation is coming.
Okay, so thank you.
I'm not sure what it is. Already in Polish and in Chinese, and I've been promised by the American editors that they're going to translate. I think for Mexico predominantly, but it is happening.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think it was an excellent talk. There are many comments telling thank you to you, so they couldn't tell you directly or speak to you directly, but on behalf of the audience, I think it was a large audience. Thank you very much for your interesting talk.
Francisco, my pleasure. This is a strange way of doing things, but it's nice to hear that people enjoyed it.
That people enjoyed, yes. Okay.